Marlene Pierce had lived her entire adult life believing that the quiet rhythms of rural Wisconsin would always be enough to keep her grounded. In Maplefield, a small town tucked between endless cornfields and stretches of pine forest, the days rarely changed. The hum of tractors in the distance, the whistle of freight trains at dusk, and the comforting smell of dew on cut grass before sunrise. She filled her mornings with the sound of an old coffee maker sputtering to life, folded laundry with the precision only a Midwestern mother could maintain, and swept the wooden porch that had stood through 40 winters. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just life, steady as the ticking of the clock above her kitchen sink. But lately, the air inside the Pierce household had shifted in a way Marlene struggled to articulate. It wasn't a single moment, not a particular argument or incident, just a collection of small, unsettling signs that built up like dust accumulating in corners no one bothered to reach. Her daughter-in-law, Clarice Dalton Pierce, had always been polite, sweet, and agreeable since marrying Marlene's son Callum 2 years earlier. Clarice had moved to Maplefield from a suburban neighborhood outside Minneapolis, bringing youthful energy and a touch of modern style into the old wooden farmhouse. Then, almost without warning, Clarice began slipping out of the house more often. At first the reasons were harmless by small-town American standards: meeting a friend for lattes at a cafe, running errands in town, or helping an elderly neighbor with groceries. But as the weeks passed, the excuses grew vaguer, the trips longer, and the energy Clarice brought home became strangely jittery, as if she'd spent the afternoon somewhere she didn't want to admit. What unsettled Marlene most was how Clarice's smile had changed. It wasn't the warm, open smile she used to greet the family with. Now it felt practiced, stretched just enough to look convincing, yet too quick to fade as soon as she turned away. Callum, who worked long shifts as an operations engineer at the agricultural machinery plant, didn't notice a thing. He adored Clarice. Trusted her. Believed her kindness was as solid as the Midwest soil beneath them. He was the kind of man who fixed broken porch steps before anyone asked, who apologized even when he didn't know what he'd done wrong. A good American husband, steady, dependable, devoted. But Marlene saw what Callum couldn't. One Wednesday afternoon, when the skies were thick with low gray clouds promising early snowfall, Clarice walked into the kitchen with her jacket already zipped. "Mom, I'm heading out for a while," she said. Clarice always called Marlene Mom, though something about the word lately felt brittle. "Everett needs help moving some things from his shop."
Marlene Frotze. Everett Pierce. Her ex-husband.
A man whose restlessness had once taken him across the country, repairing farm equipment for whoever paid well enough. The man who eventually left Marlene and a teenage Callum behind in that very farmhouse, returning only decades later when chronic back pain forced him to slow down. Everett still carried the same rugged charm he'd had in his 30s, graying now, weathered, quieter, but Clarice helping him? Constantly? It didn't fit. But Marlene forced a smile.
"Drive safe, honey."
Clarice nodded, grabbed her purse, and slipped out into the cold. She returned nearly 3 hours later. That night, while they sat around the dinner table eating Marlene's meatloaf, Callum asked what had taken so long. "Oh, your dad misplaced half the tools he needed," Clarice answered quickly. "We spent most of the time just searching for things." Her tone was casual. Too casual.
Marlene saw the way Clarice avoided Callum's eyes.
Saw the way her hand trembled slightly when she lifted her glass. Saw the lie before it even left her lips.
2 days later came the storm.
Not outside, though. Rain hammered the roof relentlessly, but inside Marlene's chest, where unease twisted like a tight knot. Clarice left the house again just after 7 p.m., claiming she needed to pick up snacks and ingredients for breakfast the next morning. "Don't wait up," she chirped, grabbing her keys. Marlene stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Clarice hurry to the car like someone fleeing a situation, not running an errand. As soon as the taillights disappeared into the wet darkness, Marlene moved. She grabbed her old coat, shoved her feet into her worn boots, and rushed out to her pickup truck, an aging blue Ford that rattled and coughed every time she started it. Her heart thudded loud enough to drown out the sputter of the engine. She didn't know why she was doing this. She just knew she had to. Marlene pulled onto the slick highway, keeping far enough back to avoid Clarice seeing her headlights in the mirrors. The rain fell in shimmering diagonal sheets, each passing car spraying water like mist across the windshield. Clarice drove past every grocery store, every gas station, every place someone might logically go. Finally, she turned onto a rural side road leading toward the dim lights of Howard's Dinero retro chrome-sided restaurant, famous locally for its bottomless coffee and blueberry pie.
Clarice parked,
and Marlene watched, breath caught in her throat, as another vehicle pulled in moments later.
A dark pickup. Everett stepped out.
Marlene felt something inside her ribs crack, though she couldn't name what exactly. Fear? Betrayal? Recognition of a pattern she had already lived once in her life? Everett didn't act like a father-in-law greeting a daughter-in-law. He smiled too warmly,
Touched Clarice's arm too gently.
Leaned in too close as they walked toward the diner door. Marlene ducked down in her seat so quickly she struck her shoulder against the steering wheel. Rain drummed violently on the roof, matching the pounding of her heartbeat. She dared to glance back up. Through the fogged windows of the diner, she could see them sit together in a booth, the kind with red vinyl seats splitting at the seams. Everett moved closer, almost shoulder to shoulder. Clarice tucked her hair back the way a woman does when she wants a man to see her face clearly. Marlene's stomach dropped. Her breath turned shallow and sharp. She wasn't mistaken. She wasn't imagining. Whatever this was, whatever they were doing, it was wrong. Horribly, unforgivably wrong. She shut her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples to stop the dizziness. No mother should ever have to witness the seeds of her own child's heartbreak growing right in front of her. After several long, torturous minutes, she turned the key in the ignition and drove away before either of them stepped back outside. The rain blurred everything: the road, the lights, the edges of the world, until even her thoughts felt soaked and heavy. When she walked back into the house later, drenched and exhausted, Callum was asleep on the couch with the TV flickering quietly.
Clarice still wasn't home.
Marlene hung her coat, sat down alone at the kitchen table, and rested her trembling hands on the cool wood surface. This small American town had always felt safe, predictable, honest. But tonight, in the middle of the storm, she realized something she could never take back. Her family, her only son's marriage, was standing on the edge of a cliff that only she had seen. And she had no idea how far the fall would be. The morning after Marlene witnessed the scene at Howard's diner, the world outside looked deceptively calm.
A soft layer of frost coated the front yard, turning the grass stiff and pale under the early Wisconsin sun.
The kind of morning that usually made her feel grateful for ordinary things: fresh coffee, warm slippers, quiet house. Today, the silence felt heavier,
almost suffocating.
She moved through the kitchen on muscle memory alone, filling the coffee maker, slicing fruit for breakfast, pretending not to glance compulsively at the window every few seconds. She expected Clarice to appear at the door, cheerful and breezy as always, dropping another flimsy explanation about losing track of time. But Clarice didn't come down. Instead, Callum did, dark circles beneath his eyes, hair a mess, looking like a man who didn't know where his wife had been but didn't want to ask. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, rubbing the sleep from his face. "Morning, sweetheart," Marlene replied, forcing a steady tone. "Clarice said she wasn't feeling well," he added.
"She is staying in bed."
Of course she was. After sneaking around town with Everett, the last thing Clarice needed was to face the woman who knew exactly what she had done. Marlene felt the same ache she'd felt years ago during her divorce, except this time, the betrayal wasn't aimed at her directly. Somehow that made it worse. Much worse. She tended to the stove, flipping bacon in the pan, letting the familiar smell drift through the house. Homemaking was her armor, the one thing she could control when everything else seemed dangerously unstable. Later that afternoon, once Callum had left for his shift at the machinery plant, Marlene positioned herself at the dining table under the pretense of sorting old bills. In reality, she watched Clarice move around the house slowly, cautiously, as if trying not to draw attention. Clarice avoided eye contact and spoke only when necessary. Her entire demeanor had changed. She was hiding something. And Marlene knew exactly what. When the younger woman finally grabbed her purse and slipped out for a quick trip to the hardware store, Marlene waited 60 seconds, then reached for her own keys. She didn't follow her this time. She didn't need to. Instead, she drove to Everett's small repair shop on the west side of town. The building was a squat brick structure with peeling white paint and a crooked sign that read Pierce Equipment and Repair. It was late enough in the season that most farmers had already winterized their machinery, so the lot was mostly empty. But Everett's old truck sat parked in its usual spot beside the loading ramp. Marlene stepped out, cold air biting her cheeks. Footsteps sounded on gravel as Everett came around from behind the building, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. He stopped when he saw her. "Marlene," he said, voice a mixture of surprise and caution. "Didn't expect you." She crossed her arms tightly over her chest.
"I am not here for small talk."
Everett shifted, adjusting his weight uneasily, unusual for a man who usually carried himself with rugged confidence. "All right," he said slowly. "Then what's this about?" Marlene took one step forward. "You know exactly what this is about."
Everett froze.
Something flickered across his expression, guilt, shame, perhaps fear, but it was gone too quickly to identify. He pretended not to understand. "Marlene, I'm not following." "You're lying," she snapped, sharper than she'd sounded in years. "You've been meeting with Clarice behind Callum's back. I saw you. At the diner. Last night." His breath hitched. He didn't deny it. Didn't even try. "Marlene," he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "No. I'm not interested in excuses. Not this time." Her voice trembled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak she hadn't felt since the day he walked out of her life decades ago. "You almost ruined us once," she said. "Now you're doing it to your own son." Everett's jaw clenched as he tossed the rag aside. For a moment, he looked smaller, older than Marlene had ever seen him. "It's complicated," he muttered. "It's filthy," she corrected. "You're his father, Everett." He winced.
"And Clarice,"
Marlene added. "She's his wife." A long, terrible silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant rumble of a passing truck on the highway. Finally Everett whispered, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Marlene stared at him with disbelief, her breath burning in her chest. "And how far is it?" she demanded. "Tell me." Everett looked at the ground. The answer was obvious. More than a mistake. More than a moment of weakness. It was a full affair. "Unbelievable," Marlene whispered, pressing her fingers to her forehead. "You're repeating the same damn mistakes that ruined our marriage. Except this time, you're tearing down our son's life." Everett reached out as if to steady himself against the wall, the shame settling like dust on his shoulders. "I didn't plan for any of this," he repeated softly. "What, she tripped and fell into your arms?"
Marlene's voice rose with incredulous fury.
"You're old enough to know better.
She is young enough to be your daughter."
Everett swallowed hard. "You think I don't know that?" "Clearly you don't." They stared at each other, two people bound by history and broken promises, now tied by a scandal far worse than the one that destroyed them years ago.
Marlene's breath fogged in the freezing air.
She wrapped her coat tighter and stepped back. "This ends now," she said.
"Whatever you think you feel, whatever she tells you, you deserve it ends.
I won't let Callum suffer the same abandonment I did." Everett looked pained, but didn't argue. She turned to leave, but paused. "If you continue this," she warned, "I will drag this entire town into it. And trust me, Everett, people here may forgive affair drama once, but they will not forgive a father stealing the happiness of his own son." Everett didn't respond. He didn't have to. The message hit him harder than any physical blow. Over the next 2 weeks, Marlene watched Clarice's every move. Not with open hostility, no, she was far too old and too wise for dramatic confrontations, but with a quiet, piercing awareness sharpened by decades of surviving heartbreak. She noticed Clarice's phone lighting up with notifications at odd hours. She noticed the way the young woman slipped outside to take calls instead of answering them in the living room. She noticed how she returned from errands with her makeup smudged or her hair slightly disheveled. Callum remained blissfully unaware. He came home exhausted each night, greeted Clarice with the same affectionate warmth, and talked excitedly about updating their guest room into a nursery someday, even though Clarice always changed the subject.
Marlene's heart twisted painfully every time.
She kept writing notes in a small spiral-bound notebook she hid inside the drawer of her bedside table.
Times Clarice left.
Places she went. How long she stayed. All organized with precision: dates, descriptions, suspicions, evidence. Not because she wanted to expose Clarice, but because she feared one day she would be forced to. Every night, long after Callum and Clarice had gone to bed, Marlene sat alone in the kitchen with only the sound of the refrigerator humming. She sipped lukewarm tea and stared at the dark window, reflecting on how betrayal had seeped back into her life in the worst possible way, not through her own marriage this time, but through the marriage of the child she had raised with all the love she had left. She prayed for clarity, for strength, for any miracle that would stop the disaster she saw unraveling before her. But miracles never came easily in the American Midwest. Life here taught people to endure, not hope. So she endured. And she prepared for the day the truth would break open, because Marlene Pierce understood something Clarice and Everett clearly did not. Secrets in small towns never stay buried for long. Valentine's Day crept into Maplefield with a strange kind of brightness, the kind that feels cheerful on the surface but hollow underneath. Snow from last week's storm still clung stubbornly to the fields, creating long patches of white that gleamed under the pale February sun. Inside the Pierce house, pink greeting cards and discount chocolate boxes sat stacked in the local grocery aisles, but Marlene felt none of the usual warmth the holiday brought. She felt something else instead.
A need for truth. A need for light.
A need to stop pretending. For weeks, she had watched the strange dance unfolding between Clarice and Everett, quiet movements, secret glances, the faint scent of a lie hanging in the air like wood smoke. She had confronted Everett, but the confrontation had solved nothing. His guilt hadn't stopped anything. If anything, their affair had only grown bolder, more reckless, more desperate. Marlene hated that she had become someone who watched from shadows. Hated that she knew more about her daughter-in-law than her own son did. Hated the weight of the truth buried in her chest. That morning, as Callum left for his shift, he kissed Clarice's forehead and reminded her of the dinner reservation he'd made at the Millstone Grill, the nicest restaurant within 50 miles. He'd saved tips from extra weekend shifts to afford the meal. He wanted the night to feel special, even though Clarice barely met his eyes.
"Can't he wait?" she said softly.
Marlene heard the lie in her voice instantly. When Callum pulled out of the driveway, Clarice took a long shower, carefully drying her hair and applying soft makeup, not the kind she wore for a romantic evening with her husband, but the kind she wore when she didn't want anyone to notice she'd gotten ready at all. Then the moment that made everything inside Marlene freeze. Clarice stepped outside, looked around quickly, and got into her car with a determination that didn't match her story about meeting a friend for lunch.
Lunch. On Valentine's Day.
With a friend? No. She was going to meet Everett. Marlene didn't stop to think. She grabbed her coat and keys and followed. The drive into Madison was long, 2 hours of farmland, windmills, and bursts of traffic where the highway expanded. Clarice kept to the speed limit, turning into side roads with the ease of someone who had traveled them more than once. Marlene kept her distance, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. Her heart pounded in a slow, relentless rhythm that matched the passing mile markers. Halfway there, snow began to drift through the air again, fine, glittering flakes swirling like dust in the cold wind. Cars around her flicked on their headlights.
The sky dimmed.
A strange quiet settled over the highway, as if the weather itself sensed that something monumental was coming. By the time Clarice reached the edge of Madison, the snow had turned into a steady curtain. She exited near a row of renovated brick buildings, passing boutique shops and coffee bars filled with college students. Marlene stayed behind several cars, watching. Finally, Clarice pulled into the parking lot of a hotel, a mid-range, business-class place with red awnings and polished glass doors. The kind of hotel where people met when they had something to hide.
Marlene s breath hitched.
The hotel sign glowed faintly through the snow.
Madison Harbor Suites.
She watched as Clarice parked, waited, and then exactly 2 minutes later Everett's dark pickup truck pulled into the lot. It was too much. Too real. Too blatant. Marlene felt her heart stutter painfully, a sensation that made her grip her chest for a moment. They didn't greet each other like people afraid of getting caught. They greeted each other like people who already knew they wouldn't stop. Everett placed a gentle hand on Clarice's arm as she stepped out of her car. Clarice leaned into him like someone seeking warmth, comfort, something deeper.
Something forbidden.
Marlene let the engine idle as she watched them enter the hotel lobby together, their bodies close, their steps synchronized. For several minutes, she sat motionless, staring at the red awning until her vision blurred. Her breath fogged the inside of her truck windows. Her body trembled not from the cold outside but from a deeper chill that came from the realization that everything she feared was not only true but happening in real time, in a way that could no longer be reasoned away. She had to see more. She had to know without doubt what was happening behind that door. She turned off her engine and stepped out into the snow. Her boots crunched loudly, each step feeling heavy and irreversible. She kept her hood low, using falling snow as cover, and walked through the revolving glass doors into the warm hotel lobby. Inside, the air smelled of citrus cleaner and freshly brewed coffee. A fireplace crackled beneath a wide painting of Lake Mendota. Marlene stood near a potted plant, pretending to read a brochure about local attractions while her eyes scanned the elevator. Then she saw its elevator numbers ticking upward, 233. Stopping on floor 3. Marlene waited until the elevator returned. She stepped inside, heart thundering, and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The elevator climbed slowly, humming with an almost mocking calm. When the doors opened, she stepped onto the soft carpeted hallway. A long row of identical doors stretched out before her, lined with gold room numbers and soft wall sconces. Marlene's footsteps were soundless as she walked down the hallway, unsure which room she was looking for until she saw it. Room 312.
Door slightly open. Just a sliver.
Just enough. Her pulse slammed in her ears. She didn't want to see. She had to see. She moved closer, each inch heavier than the last, until she could hear the faint sound of voices muffled at first, then clearer.
A soft, breathless laugh. A deep murmur of a man's voice.
Sheets rustling.
Marlene's vision tunneled.
With a shaking hand, she pushed the door open the smallest amount. And what she saw ended any remaining hope that she had misread the situation. Everett and Clarice were inside the room, on the bed, tangled in a way that left no doubt. Clarice's hair spilled across Everett's chest. His hands were on her hips. Their faces were closer than any father-in-law and daughter-in-law should ever be. Marlene didn't scream, didn't gasp. She simply stepped back, one hand clasped tightly over her mouth, the other gripping the doorframe so hard her nails scraped the paint. The world around her seemed to warp, like the hallway had tilted, like the air had been sucked out of the building. She stumbled away from the door, nearly tripping over her own feet as she backed down the hall. Her chest felt tight, her lungs refusing to expand. She didn't remember reaching the elevator. Didn't remember walking through the lobby. Didn't remember reaching her truck. All she remembered was the steering wheel beneath her shaking hands and the heavy, unbearable weight of betrayal pressing down on her like a physical force. While snow continued to fall softly outside, coating the windshield in white, Marlene's tears didn't fall. Not yet. Not in a public parking lot. Not where strangers could see. Midwestern women didn't cry where others could witness it. They held everything in until it almost crushed them. And Marlene, gripping the wheel so tightly her fingers numbed, felt the crushing begin. She drove home through the blizzard on autopilot, headlights cutting through swirling white. The world outside was silent, empty, indifferent. Every mile felt like a mile further away from the life she thought her son still had. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Clarice's car wasn't there. Callum was still at work. Marlene sat in the truck for several minutes, forehead resting against the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. The house in front of her looked the same, warm, yellow lights glowing in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney, but the life inside it had changed forever. She stepped out, walked through the snow, and entered the kitchen. Only thinly in the privacy of the home where she had raised her son did her tears finally fall, silently, uncontrollably, like the snow outside. Clarice returned hours later, humming as if she'd just come from a friendly lunch. She didn't notice Marlene's red eyes or the tension in her shoulders. But Marlene noticed everything. She looked at Clarice with a calmness so absolute it almost felt dangerous. Because now she knew the full truth. Not suspicion. Not possibility. Truth. Devastating truth. Truth that would soon explode through their lives like a winter storm tearing apart the fields. And as Clarice walked upstairs, unaware that her world was about to unravel, Marlene whispered to herself, "This will destroy him. And I'm the only one who knows it's coming." The weeks after Valentine's Day unfolded with a strange heaviness, like a long winter that refused to thaw. Snow melted into slush, slush into mud, and the fields of Wisconsin began their slow shift toward spring. Yet inside the Pierce household, nothing felt renewed. Everything felt suspended, breath held, truth buried, time stretched thin over a wound no one but Marlene knew existed. Callum still believed his marriage was intact. Clarice still pretended it was. And Everett, God help him, still lingered on the edges of their lives like a storm cloud waiting to break. Marlene lived those days with a kind of numb clarity. She woke early, cooked meals, folded laundry, and tended to the small herb garden she kept in pots by the window. But every action was overshadowed by the knowledge she carried alone, knowledge that sat inside her like a shard of ice. She had seen the truth. She had witnessed the betrayal. She had walked through the door of room 312 and lost the ability to pretend. Yet she said nothing. Because she knew that the truth, when it finally came, would break her son in ways she feared he could not recover from. Then, on a warm day in early April, everything began to shift. Marlene had just returned from the local farmer's market when she heard Clarice's footsteps coming down the stairs. The younger woman's face was pale, almost translucent, and she held a small white envelope in one trembling hand.
Mom. Clarisse whisperet. Can we talk? Marlene frotze.
She knew that tone. She knew fear when she heard it. Of course, she said quietly, setting her grocery bags aside.
Sit down.
Clarisse dropped into a kitchen chair, clutching the envelope like it contained the weight of her entire life. Her eyes were glassy, ringed with exhaustion. For a brief moment, she looked less like a woman hiding an affair and more like a child caught in a storm too big for her. Clarisse swallowed hard. I went to the doctor today. Marlene's heart tightened. And? She asked softly. There's no easy way to say it, Clarisse whispered. I'm pregnant. The world seemed to tip for a moment, tilting the kitchen floor beneath Marlene's feet. She gripped the back of the chair, breath caught in her throat. Pregnant. Clarisse was pregnant. With whose child? What did Callum say? Marlene asked automatically, though she already knew the real question was burning behind her words. I haven't told him yet, Clarisse replied. Don't want to until I'm sure of everything. Marlene's heart hammered painfully. Sure of what, Clarisse? Clarisse slid the envelope across the table. It was a lab slip. A request for additional genetic screening. Then Clarisse whispered the sentence Marlene had been dreading more than anything. The doctor asked if there was any chance. Her voice cracked. Any chance the father could be someone other than Callum.
Marlene, es breath caught. Clarisse buried her face in her hands, shaking.
I didn't tell him anything. I just agreed to more tests. But I know what they're looking for. Marlene stared at the envelope, her hands trembling. The walls of the kitchen seemed to close in around her. And Everett? She asked quietly. Does he know? Clarisse didn't look up.
No.
Not yet. A deep, pulsing silence filled the room. Marlene pressed her palms to the cool wooden table, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Do you want me to help you open it? She asked. Clarisse nodded. Marlene slid her finger beneath the seal and unfolded the crisp sheets inside. Words swam at first, numbers, percentages, markers. Then one line snapped into focus with brutal clarity. Probability of biological paternity, 99.9%. Likely father, Everett Pierce. Marlene didn't gasp. She didn't scream. The world simply drained of color as every fear she'd held tightened into a single point of certainty. Clarisse was carrying Everett's child.
Her ex-husband's child. Her son's wife's child.
Her son's brother. A child her son would believe was his own miracle after years of infertility. For several long seconds, Marlene couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't even feel.
Clarisse choked out a sob.
I didn't mean for this. I swear to God, I didn't mean for any of this. Marlene folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it down carefully beside Clarisse's shaking hand. When did you know? She asked, voice low. Clarisse wiped her eyes. When the doctor asked about genetic discrepancies.
It made everything real.
Two couldn't pretend anymore.
Marlene sank slowly into the chair beside her.
Do you love him? She asked.
Clarisse's shoulders sagged.
I don't know. Maybe I thought I did. Maybe I thought he understood me more than Callum did. Maybe I was lonely. Maybe I was stupid. That's not love, Marlene said quietly. Clarisse nodded helplessly. I know. But now there's a baby.
A baby.
Marlene's throat closed. She could already imagine how Callum would react. Joy first, overwhelming joy, believing his prayers were answered at last. and then once the truth surfaced, grief so deep it might drown him. She pictured his face when he learned his wife had betrayed him with his own father. Pictured the shattering of a man who had already survived one parent's abandonment.
Pictured a pain no mother ever wanted to witness.
Marlene's chest ached. Clarice looked at her with wide, pleading eyes. "What should I do, Mom?" For the first time, Marlene felt something unexpected for the young woman, a flicker of pity. Clarice had done something unforgivable, but she was also trapped in something monstrous, something spiraling beyond her control.
"First," Marlene said softly, "you must tell Callum the truth."
Clarice flinched violently. "I can't. It'll kill him." "It'll destroy him either way," Marlene replied. "But better he hears it from you than finds out accidentally later."
Clarisses lip trembled. "What about Everett?" Marlene's expression hardened.
"I'll deal with Everett." A new silence set Leda, silence full of resignation, fear, and the awareness that the tide had fully turned.
Nothing could go back to normal.
Nothing could be mended without breaking first. Clarice looked at her stomach, barely showing yet, and whispered, "I don't even know if I can keep the baby."
Marlene closed her eyes. The Midwest taught women to endure everything, failing crops, harsh winters, lost loved ones.
But this was something even endurance couldn't soften. "Whatever happens," Marlene said quietly, "I'll help Callum through it. But Clarice, once this comes out, our family will never be the same."
Clarice broke down crying.
Marlene sat beside her, stone still. A mother, a witness, a keeper of a truth that would tear apart everything she'd spent a lifetime holding together. That night, after Callum and Clarice had gone to bed, Marlene sat alone in the dim kitchen. The test results lay folded neatly on the table, illuminated only by the soft hum of the refrigerator light. She reached for the letter again, opened it one more time, and stared at the numbers until they blurred into nothing.
99,9%.
No ambiguity.
No miracle loophole. No mercy.
She folded the paper, slipped it into her apron, and pressed the fabric against her chest. Her heart felt heavy, too heavy. She moved to the sink, splashed water on her face, then stood looking at her reflection in the dark window. Her own eyes stared back, tired, haunted, knowing. The snow outside glowed faintly in the moonlight. Spring was coming. But for her family, winter had only just begun. The truth did not reveal itself with a scream, nor with a dramatic confrontation fueled by anger. It revealed itself the way a slow leak turns into a flood, quietly at first, deceptively manageable, and then, all at once, catastrophic. 4 days after the DNA results, Marlene lived in a state of suspended dread. She cooked, cleaned, tended to her garden, and exchanged polite greetings with neighbors. But beneath the surface, she braced for the inevitable, the moment Clarice would no longer be able to keep her secret contained. Marlene knew that secrets, especially in a small American town like Maplefield, behaved like wildfire. Once sparked, they spread uncontrollably. She prayed in those days, not for forgiveness, no, forgiveness was too far away, but for strength to withstand what was coming. And then it happened.
Not in the way she imagined.
Not with calm discussion or mutual understanding. But with a collapse so sudden, so brutal, it fractured every piece of Callum's world in a single breath. It began after a simple dinner. Marlene made smoked sausage with sweet potatoes, a typical Midwest meal for early spring. The air smelled warm and comforting: paprika, caramelized onions, a hint of rosemary. She hoped the familiarity of the food would bring some gentle quiet into a house suffocating with tension.
Callum came home tired but smiling, happily reciting anecdotes from the factory floor.
He talked about a co-worker's new tractor, joked about a supervisor's bad haircut, and mentioned how he couldn't wait to repaint the nursery room was set on sunshine yellow walls.
Clarice barely touched her plate.
Her hands trembled whenever she lifted her fork. Her eyes kept darting toward Marlene, then away, filled with panic. Marlene felt the storm gathering, the way a woman who had lived through 60 Wisconsin winters could recognize the shift in air pressure before a blizzard. It happened as Callum reached for his glass of iced tea and asked cheerfully, innocently, "So when should we start telling people the news, honey? Mom already knows. I want the guys at work to hear it from me first."
Clarisse froze.
Completely. Her lips parted, her breath shallow, her hands trembling so violently the fork slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the plate, loud and sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet dining room.
Callum blinked.
"Baby? What's wrong?" Clarisse's eyes filled instantly with tears. She pressed a shaking hand over her mouth.
"Callum," she whispered, "zwei kennt."
Callum frowned, confused. "Can't what?"
"What is going on?"
Clarisse looked at Marlene just once, quickly, desperately as if asking permission. Marlene didn't nod. Didn't shake her head. She simply lowered her gaze. Because the time had come.
Clarisse sobbed. "It is not yours."
The silence that followed was so total, so heavy, it felt like all the oxygen in the room had been sucked away. Callum's face drained of color. "What did you just say?"
Clarisse collapsed into tears, words tumbling out in broken confessions.
"I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it. I was lonely. I didn't think. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know. I didn't." Callum slammed his hands on the table so hard the plates jumped. "Stop.
Just stop."
His voice cracked in a way Marlene had not heard since he was 10 years old and his father had walked out the door.
Clarisse wept harder.
"It's Everett's. The baby, it's Everett's." Callum's mind couldn't catch up cold and process the words. He stared at his wife as though seeing a stranger. Marlene watched him with a mother's agony, feeling each second stretch into something unbearable.
Callum whispered, "My father."
His voice broke completely on the last word. Clarisse nodded weakly, head bowed, unable to face him. Callum stood so quickly his chair slammed backward onto the floor. His chest heaved. His eyes were wide, red, empty. "No," he muttered.
"No.
"No. No. This isn't real." He backed away from the table, nearly tripping over his fallen chair. Clarisse tried to reach for him.
"Callum, please."
But he lurched backward like her touch was poison. His voice shook violently.
"You slept with my father?"
"My father."
Clarisse sobbed harder.
"I didn't mean for it. Stop saying that," he roared.
The sound shook the walls.
Marlene jumped to her feet.
"Callum, sweetheart, please."
But he wasn't listening. His face twisted with something raw: betrayal, disbelief, grief so deep it bordered on madness. He grabbed the side of the counter for support, his breathing frantic. "I trusted you," he said, pointing at Clarisse.
"I built a life with you. I dreamed with you."
"And you were with him." Clarisse cried, "I'm sorry, I told you, I never meant to." Callum slammed his fist against the wall so hard the wooden frame vibrated. "Stop lying. Stop apologizing.
Stop everything."
A brittle silence followed as his voice echoed through the house. Then he whispered, more broken than before. "How long?" Clarisse couldn't answer. "How long?" Callum shouted. She flinched. 6 months. Callum closed his eyes. A soft, strangled sound escaped him as if the world had punched the air out of his lungs.
He staggered toward the kitchen doorway, hands shaking uncontrollably.
I can't breathe, this isn't real." Marlene rushed toward him.
Callum, sit down please.
He pushed past her, pacing in frantic circles like a trapped animal. His breath hitched, becoming shallow, erratic, ragged with hysteria. He slammed his fist again, this time into a cabinet door. It cracked under the impact, and his knuckles instantly split, blood smearing the wood.
Callum. Marlene cried. Stop, you re-hurting yourself.
He didn't hear her. He didn't hear anything. He was dissolving in front of her eyes, crumbling piece by piece. Clarice collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her stomach as if to protect the child within from the world falling apart around her. Late that night, after the storm of yelling, sobbing, and destruction had burned itself out, Callum sat on the living room floor, leaning against the sofa, staring blankly at the wall. His hands were bandaged. His face was hollow. His body unmoving except for the occasional tremor. Clarice had retreated upstairs, packing a few bags between sobs, insisting she would leave in the morning. Marlene didn't stop her. Couldn't stop her. Callum seemed lost in a void somewhere between shock and collapse. Marlene sat beside him, her hand on his arm, whispering gentle, broken words.
You re not alone. I'm here. I am right here, sweetheart.
He didn't respond. Not a word. Not a sound. Only one tear traced silently down his cheek, the only tear he shed that entire night. But for a Midwestern man like Callum, one tear meant devastation beyond measure. In the days that followed, Callum unraveled completely. He stopped eating. Stopped sleeping. Stopped going to work. Stopped speaking. He sat on the porch for hours, staring into the fields as if waiting for something, maybe clarity, maybe forgiveness, maybe the version of his life he thought he had. Neighbors noticed. They whispered. They speculated. But Marlene protected him fiercely, shutting down questions with sharp looks and quick lies. He's tired. He's sick. He's dealing with stress. He'll be fine. None of it was true. Inside the house, she helped him dress. Helped him drink water. Helped him walk when his legs trembled. Helped him through nightmares where he woke gasping and clutching his chest. The family doctor came once, spoke quietly with Marlene, and said in a grave voice, "This is acute emotional trauma. He needs support, patience, and time." Time. Marlene hated that word. Time did not heal wounds like these. Time only softened the edges of pain. But the center stayed sharp forever. Meanwhile, Clarice remained in the house longer than expected. Not out of selfishness, but because she was visibly breaking, too terrified, ashamed, vomiting from stress and morning sickness alike. 3 days after the confession, she approached Marlene in the kitchen. Her voice was small. "I'll leave tomorrow." She placed folded bills on the counter, money she'd saved from her part-time work, and whispered, "I don't expect forgiveness. Not from anyone." Marlene looked at her for a long moment. She saw the guilt, the fear,
the desperation, and something else, something unexpected.
The look of someone who regretted too late. Someone who knew she had destroyed herself as much as she destroyed others. Marlene didn't pick up the money. Instead, she quietly opened a drawer and handed Clarice an envelope filled with several $100s, her own savings, tucked away over years of careful budgeting.
"Go far," Marlene said softly. "As far as you can.
And don't come back." Clarice cried silently, nodded, and returned upstairs. She left before dawn the next morning without saying goodbye. Only her faint perfume lingered in the hallway, a ghost of a life that had ended. When Callum woke to find the house quieter than usual, he didn't ask where Clarice was. He didn't need to. He simply stared at the empty space at the kitchen table, then closed his eyes and whispered, "It hurts, Mom." It was the first full sentence he had spoken in days. Marlene wrapped her arms around him. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered, holding him tight. "I know." Inside her chest, her heart broke for him all over again. Because she knew something he didn't yet realize. The worst was not over. The worst was still coming. And when it arrived, she feared her son might never rise from it. Spring arrived in Maplefield with an unsettling gentleness. Birds returned to the pines, the soil thawed enough for early planting, and warm breezes swept across the open fields. Yet, inside the Pierce farmhouse, the seasons refused to change. The house remained locked in a winter of silence and grief, where the cold lived not in the walls but in the human heart. Callum Pierce, once a man full of kindness and quiet determination, had become a ghost inside his own life. He no longer left the house. No longer returned messages from co-workers. No longer touched the half-finished nursery he had once painted sunshine yellow. He drifted through the rooms in slow, aimless movements, like someone walking underwater, every gesture heavy, every breath a struggle. His eyes, once warm and steady, had lost their color, replaced by a dull haze that frightened Marlene far more than any outburst ever could. He spoke rarely. When he did, the words were small, fragile, as if they hurt to say.
"I can sleep.
It won't stop." Why him? Why her? Why me? Questions without answers. Questions Marlene could not ease. Nights were the hardest. Marlene often found her son sitting on the edge of his bed long after midnight, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like the truth was carved into the wooden planks. Sometimes he cried silently, shoulders shaking. Sometimes he didn't move at all. Once, she overheard him whisper,
"I wasn't enough." The words pierced her like a blade.
Because if there was one thing she knew about her son, it was that he had always been enough, more than enough for any decent woman. But Clarice had not been decent. And Everett had shattered something in Callum that might never be restored. Marlene hated her ex-husband with a fury she didn't know she was capable of feeling. She hated how easily he destroyed lives, first hers, now Callum's. She hated that he walked through the world with the charm of a man who believed the rules did not apply to him. Everett had not contacted Callum once since the confession. Coward. One afternoon in late May, Marlene found Callum outside on the back porch. He sat on the old wooden swing, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the horizon where the field met the sky. A breeze rustled the young corn plants. Callum didn't move. "Sweetheart," Marlene said gently, stepping onto the porch. He didn't look up. She sat beside him on the swing, the wood creaking softly beneath their weight. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, in a trembling voice, Callum whispered, "Mom, I don't know how to live with this." Marlene's heart clenched. "You don't have to know right now. You just have to keep breathing." He swallowed hard.
"I feel like I am drowning every second."
"I know," she murmured, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "But drowning people can still be pulled out."
"You still here."
"But I don't feel here." The words were soft, but they terrified her more than anything he had said before. "Callum," she whispered, gripping his hand tightly, "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I am right here. You won't face this alone." He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of early summer soil, fresh, earthy, alive. It was a smell that usually filled Midwestern hearts with hope. But hope felt far away for Callum. In early June, a letter arrived.
From Clarice.
The envelope was thin, handwritten, postmarked from a coastal town in Oregon. Marlene recognized her neat handwriting immediately. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the letter as dread pooled in her stomach. She didn't want Callum to see it. didn't want him to be dragged back into the spiral he was barely surviving. So she did what she had done with the others. She opened it alone. Inside was a small photographer newborn baby wrapped in a soft cream-colored blanket. The child's eyes were closed, tiny fingers curled into a fist.
Blonde hair barely visible.
Beside the photo was a short message. Her name is Emilia. She's healthy. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday she might. I think about all of you every day. Clarice.
Marlene's hands shook as she read.
She looked again at the baby's face, those faint features that carried Everett's unmistakable stamp.
The shape of the nose.
The jawline. Even the slight arch of the eyebrows. Callum's sibling.
Callum's wife's baby.
A mix of innocence and betrayal bundled into a newborn. The photograph blurred as Marlene's eyes filled with tears. She folded the letter slowly, deliberately, placing it back in the envelope. Then she walked to the wood-burning stove, opened the iron door, and fed the letter into the flames. The paper curled instantly, blackening around the edges, the baby's face disappearing into ash. Clarice's words burned away with it. Because Callum could not survive that image. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the fields, Marlene found her son sitting alone at the kitchen table. His plate was untouched. His shoulders hunched. His hands clasped tightly as if holding something invisible together. She sat across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out and placed her hand gently over his. "Tell me what you're thinking," she whispered. He stared at the table, voice raw. "I feel empty." Marlene nodded slowly, fighting tears. "That's okay. Empty isn't the end. It's just where healing begins." He shook his head. "I don't think I can heal from this." "You can," she said softly.
"Maybe not today.
Maybe not soon. But you can." Callum looked up at her then, eyes red, exhausted, hopeless. "Do you think she loved me?"
Marlene's breath caught.
She didn't lie. "I think," she said gently, "she loved the idea of you. But she didn't understand how to love anyone properly." Callum nodded, a shaky exhale leaving him. "That hurts." "I know. Love often does." He leaned toward her then slowly, like a child seeking shelter, and rested his head against her shoulder. Marlene wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, rocking him gently like she had when he was small. And in that moment, she understood. She was not just his mother now. She was his anchor. His lifeline. The only thing standing between him and complete collapse. Summer deepened. Corn grew tall. The humidity thickened. The world continued moving forward even as the Pierce household remained stuck in a quiet war against despair. Callum improved only in small, delicate increments, eating a little more, sleeping occasionally, helping with chores when he could.
Sometimes Marlene caught brief glimpses of the old Hemer's soft smile, a tired joke, a moment of clarity.
But the shadow never fully left his eyes. One evening, as fireflies lit up the backyard, Marlene stood on the porch watching them dance above the grass. Callum stepped outside, joining her silently. They stood there together, letting the night settle around them. After a while, Callum asked, "Mom, will it always hurt like this?"
Marlene hesitated.
Then she answered with quiet honesty, "Yes. But it will hurt less someday.
And you will grow around it."
Callum swallowed hard, then nodded. He slipped his hand into hers, a gesture he had not done since childhood. Marlene squeezed back, tears filling her eyes. Because she knew something he did not. The pain would never fully disappear. The betrayal would never fully fade. The memory of everything lost would always linger. But there, under the warm Midwest sky, With crickets singing and fireflies flickering around them, Marlene realized something else too. Survival was still possible. And love, the quiet, steadfast kind of a mother for her wounded son, was the one thing that would carry them forward. Slowly, painfully, but forward nonetheless. She pressed her forehead lightly against his shoulder and whispered, "We'll get through this, sweetheart. One day at a time. I promise." And for the first time in months, Callum whispered back, "Okay, Mom. One day at a time."